There is a handwritten ledger in the Library of Congress. It spans 1872 to 1915, 43 years of entries. It catalogues every arrest, every seizure, every book destroyed by one man. That man had a federal badge and the legal authority to decide what Americans could read. The ledger includes titles of the works that were seized. Some of those titles correspond to books that no longer exist anywhere, not lost in a fire or misplaced during a move. Destroyed, deliberately, by someone who kept meticulous records of the destruction. The man who burned the books kept better notes than the people who wrote them. The collection is called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice Records. It fills 7 containers in the Manuscript division. Researchers can request access, but almost nobody does. Inside those containers are arrest blotters documenting every person this organization targeted: age, nationality, religion, education, offense, evidence seized, legal outcome. And in the margins, handwritten notations by Anthony Comstock. He created the organization, lobbied Congress for the law that gave it power, and then spent 42 years enforcing that law himself. One man wrote the statute, one man got it passed, one man was appointed to carry it out. That is not how laws are supposed to work. But on March 3, 1873, that is exactly what happened. The law was called the Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use. Congress passed it with virtually no discussion. Unanimous consent in the Senate. Suspension of the rules in the House. Less than an hour of debate for a law that would reshape what Americans could read, mail, buy, and think about for the next century. 3 days later, on March 6, 1873, Comstock was commissioned as a special agent of the United States Post Office. He was given police powers, the right to arrest, and free transportation on all mail lines so he could travel the country pursuing violators. He was 28 years old. He had been a dry goods clerk. Now here is the detail that changes how you read everything that follows. The law did not define obscenity. It listed categories of prohibited material, but never specified what those categories meant. Comstock defined them. Personally, in courtrooms, he routinely barred jurors from seeing the items he had seized. He would tell the judge the materials were too vile to show. The jury would convict based on his testimony alone. That is not an exaggeration. That is documented in case records across 4 decades. You might assume this was about pornography. That is the reasonable assumption, and it is the one most people make. Comstock did target genuine obscenity. He shut down fraud operations and predatory publishers. If that were the full story, he would be a footnote. But it was never the full story. Under the same law, using the same authority, Comstock seized anatomy textbooks being mailed to medical students. He confiscated information about contraception written by licensed physicians. He arrested a man for selling a scientific article on marsupial reproduction, originally written for Popular Science Monthly. He went after works by Homer, Ovid, Chaucer, and Boccaccio. He arrested an art dealer on Fifth Avenue for selling reproductions of French paintings that depicted nudes. He seized photographs of boxing matches. He targeted political pamphlets about labor organizing and free speech. And by 1908, the law had been amended to ban materials that might incite arson or assassination, which in practice meant anarchist and socialist literature. The machinery built to suppress pornography became the machinery that suppressed ideas, and the machinery was well funded. This is the part that nobody on YouTube seems willing to examine. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice was chartered by the state legislature in May 1873, just weeks after the federal law passed. The charter granted its agents the power of search, seizure, and arrest. It also granted them something extraordinary. The NYSSV received 50% of every fine levied in cases it brought to court. Read that again. A private organization, unelected, unaccountable to voters, was given state police powers and a direct financial incentive to prosecute as aggressively as possible. Every conviction put money in their account. The more books they burned, the more they earned. That is not a moral crusade, that is a business model, and the men who funded it were not moral crusaders. The original incorporators of the NYSSV included John Pierpont Morgan, the banker whose name would define American finance for the next half-century, William E. Dodge, the copper magnate, Alfred S. Barnes, a textbook publisher who was, quite literally, in the business of deciding which books Americans could read, and Samuel Colgate, the soap manufacturer, who served as the organization's first president until his death in 1898. These were not reformers operating from conviction. These were industrialists operating from interest. They funded a censorship apparatus and staffed it with a zealot who kept impeccable records of every title he removed from circulation. Maurice Ketchum Jessup, chairman of the YMCA board, paid Comstock a salary of $3,000 a year plus expenses. By career's end, Comstock's prosecutions had generated fines totaling $237,000. Adjusted for inflation, that exceeds $6 million in today's currency. The NYSSV kept half, and the timing of the law's passage deserves scrutiny. In the winter of 1872 and 1873, the 42nd Congress was consumed by the Credit Mobilier scandal. Republican legislators had accepted bribes to support government investment in a fraudulent railroad scheme. The scandal would contribute directly to the Panic of 1873, the worst economic depression the country had experienced. Into this atmosphere of corruption and crisis walked Comstock, carrying a satchel of confiscated materials into Vice President Colfax's office. He displayed them on a mahogany table beneath a chandelier. Condoms, bawdy novels, explicit playing cards, contraceptive devices. He showed them to every legislator he could reach, and Congress, facing bribery charges and public outrage, found in Comstock's moral campaign a convenient pivot. Here was something they could pass unanimously. Something that made them look righteous, something that required no debate because who could possibly object to fighting obscenity? The law sailed through, the scandal faded, and Comstock got his badge. I want to tell you about one man who refused to comply. De Robigny Mortimer Bennett founded the Truth Seeker in 1873, the same year as the Comstock Act. His newspaper was devoted to science, morals, free thought, and human happiness. Bennett was the most successful publisher of free-thought literature in America, with subscribers including Mark Twain, Clarence Darrow, and Robert Ingersoll, the most famous orator of the 19th century. Comstock regarded Bennett as, and this is from the NYSSV records, everything vile in blasphemy and infidelity. On November 12, 1877, Comstock walked into the Truth Seeker office at 141 8th Street in Lower Manhattan with a deputy marshal and a warrant. Bennett was arrested for selling a scientific tract and a pamphlet titled An Open Letter to Jesus Christ. The arrest blotter, which you can request from the Library of Congress, reads like a character assassination. Under aliases, it says, The Truth Seeker. Under religion, infidel. Under education, common. Under occupation, publisher of blasphemous and infidel works. Under inventory of stock seized, vile tracts. Under remarks, publisher's most horrible and obscene blasphemies. That is not a legal document. That is a verdict written before the trial. Bennett was arrested twice more. The third time, on December 10, 1879, the charge was mailing a copy of a pamphlet called Cupid's Yokes, a dry sociological essay about marriage. Comstock had obtained the copy by writing to Bennett under a fictitious name, requesting it by mail. When Bennett complied, Comstock had him arrested. The technique has a modern name. We call it entrapment. But before his trial, Bennett did something that shook the entire apparatus. He published an open letter to Samuel Colgate, the president of the NYSSV, the very man overseeing the prosecution. Bennett documented that Colgate's company was mailing booklets advertising Vaseline as a form of birth control, the same postal system, the same type of material. One man was funding the prosecution, the other was being prosecuted. The difference was not the content. The difference was who had money and who had a printing press. Bennett's exposé triggered a boycott of Colgate products that lasted years, but it did not save him. The judge, Charles Benedict, ruled that freedom of the press had nothing to do with the case. The jury never read the full pamphlet. Bennett was sentenced to a $300 fine and 13 months of hard labor at Albany Penitentiary. For mailing a pamphlet, 200,000 people signed a petition for his release. Congress received it. Comstock, who had faced a separate petition of 70,000 signatures demanding repeal of his law, alleged that many of the signatures were forged. No investigation confirmed his claim, but no pardon was granted either. Bennett served his sentence, completed a world tour, and died in 1882 at the age of 64, 3 years after prison. In 2024, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression filed a petition with the President for a posthumous pardon. As of the date of this recording, none has been issued. 145 years after conviction, the government still has not admitted the prosecution was wrong. Bennett was not the only casualty. Ida Craddock was a self-taught scholar who wrote marriage advice manuals that physicians endorsed. Comstock pursued her for nearly a decade. In 1902, she was convicted for mailing a pamphlet called The Wedding Night. The jury never read it. She faced a 5-year federal sentence. She was 45 years old. On October 16, 1902, the day before sentencing, she took her own life. She left 2 letters, one to her mother, one to the public, in which she called Comstock a sex pervert who had invaded her right to freedom of religion and freedom of the press. Emma Goldman called Craddock one of the bravest champions of women's emancipation. When confronted about her death, Comstock told reporters it was imperative that mad dogs of all sizes should be killed before children are bitten. He never recovered his public standing after that statement, but the damage was already done. Elmina Drake Slinker was 59 years old, a Quaker grandmother writing articles about charity when 3 men arrived at her door in April of 1887. A Vice Society agent, a postal inspector, and a United States Marshal. She was arrested for mailing private, sealed letters containing advice about sex and marriage. Her mail had been discovered when a railroad accident in Indiana burst open a postal pouch. The postmaster read her letters and reported her. She refused to swear on a Bible at her hearing. She received 800 letters of support while in jail. Her husband refused to post her bail. I spent 3 weeks with this research before I started writing. Not because the facts were unclear, because the architecture was too clean. The financial incentives, the legal mechanism, the political timing, the destruction of printing plates. Every element fit together so precisely that I kept expecting to find the piece that didn't belong. The detail that proved the pattern was incidental. I never found it. That bothers me more than the pattern itself, because the numbers are staggering. In the first 6 months after the law passed, Comstock seized 194,000 pictures and photographs. He also took 14,200 stereopticon plates and 134,000 pounds of books. Over his career, he claimed the destruction of 284,000 pounds of printing plates, not books, plates. The physical means of reproducing a text. When you destroy a book, the book is gone. When you destroy the plates, the book can never be reprinted. Whatever was on those plates, whatever words and ideas and arguments they carried, they exist now only as entries in a ledger that almost nobody reads. His organization's official seal depicted a man in a top hat burning books. That was not a criticism, that was the mission statement. They engraved it on their letterhead. 24 states passed their own versions of the Comstock law. State and local courts convicted more than 90% of those prosecuted. But the deepest damage was the damage you cannot measure. The books that were never written, the medical information that was never mailed, the scientific papers that were never published, the political pamphlets that were never printed, not because the law forbade them specifically, but because the threat of prosecution made silence the safer choice. Publishers, doctors, educators, and artists all learned to ask a single question before committing anything to paper. Would Comstock come for this? That question reshaped American intellectual life for almost a century. Here is what I cannot stop thinking about. The Comstock Act passed in 1873. Within 30 years, the economic curriculum in American schools was quietly rewritten. By 1901, teachers across the country were being told to stop teaching the history of monetary policy, land monopoly, and deflationary economics. By 1913, the Federal Reserve Act passed, the legislative resolution of a monetary debate that the public had been denied the tools to understand. The generation that lost access to banned books through the mail also lost access to economic history in the classroom. 2 different mechanisms, 2 different decades, the same outcome. A population that could not ask certain questions because the vocabulary for asking them had been systematically removed. The Comstock Act has never been fully repealed. It was modified in 1971 to remove restrictions on contraception. Various court decisions narrowed its scope, but the statute itself remains in the United States Code. In 2023, a federal judge in Texas cited it in a ruling attempting to restrict access to medication. The legal architecture Comstock built in 1873 is not history. It is still load-bearing. The arrest blotters are in the Library of Congress. You can request them. Container numbers are listed in the finding aid. Comstock's handwriting is there. documenting every seizure, every prosecution, every title he decided the American public should never read. Some of those titles survive in other collections. Some survive only as entries in his ledger, titles without texts, names of books that no living person has read. The censor's records outlasted the works he censored. The catalogue of destruction is more complete than the catalogue of what was destroyed. And the law that authorized all of it, one man wrote it, lobbied it, and enforced it for 42 years. It was funded by Morgan, Colgate, and a textbook publisher who profited from controlling which books circulated. That law is still on the books, not as history, as statute, waiting.